Hi, I'm Dr. Jackson Crawford. I'm a specialist in the Old Norse language, currently finishing up 2 years of teaching at the University of California, Berkeley, before returning home to the Rocky Mountains to teach at the University of Colorado Boulder in fall 2017. I'm back today with another one of my videos about a topic in Norse language and myth, and today what I want to do is remake one of my oldest videos, which concerns one of the most important and compelling survivals of Old Norse literature, which is the poem called Hávamál in the Poetic Edda. Now, the pronunciation that I'm using here is reconstructed medieval Old Norse pronunciation. This is an approximation of what linguists believe the Old Norse language would have sounded like in about the 1200s when the poem Hávamál was written down. The pronunciation you may be more accustomed to hearing, Hávamál, is based on modern Icelandic pronunciation, which is often used in talking about Old Norse or in quoting Old Norse. So be aware of the difference. Both are legitimate ways of approaching the pronunciation of Old Norse. I simply prefer the reconstructed pronunciation, although I've also taught modern Icelandic. I have videos on this channel if you might be interested in the topic. One I'll link in a card concerns the medieval reconstructed pronunciation of Old Norse, and then I do have a video about modern Icelandic pronunciation, as well as the differences between Old Norse and modern Icelandic, and how we go about finding out what dead languages sounded like. So with the pronunciation of it out of the way, let's talk a little bit about what this poem is. First of all, its name, which is preserved in the manuscript that this poem is found in, consists of, from an Old Norse perspective, a compound of two words. Mol is commonly seen in the names of poems in Old Norse. For instance, it's also Grímnismál, Vafþrúðnismál, Håkonarmál, etc. And it just means words, speech, sayings. Hova is a form of the adjective hor, which means high. This is the masculine, singular, genitive, weak form of that adjective. And what that all works out to is that this means of the high one, with the high one being masculine. There is no doubt that this high one is intended to be Odin, since one of his names that he gives in his list of his names in the poem Grímnismál is in fact Hor, high one. There's also a proposal that that name of Odin, and thus the name as used in this poem, might be related to a Gothic language adjective. Gothic is a close relative of Old Norse. Hæs, which means one-eyed. This adjective is not attested in Old Norse, but if it were found in Old Norse, it would take a form very similar to that adjective hor, high. And so you could look at this as being also not just the words of the high one, but words of the one-eyed. There's no way to prove that that's what's intended, but it's an interesting possibility, which also plays into the sort of wordplay that we often do see in Old Norse poetry. It wouldn't be unusual for this to mean both the words of the high one and words of the one-eyed. In either case, it refers to Odin, who is the intended speaker of the poem. If you browse around online or in some popular books, you'll find the name of the poem written out in runes. Now, typically what people in the wide and all-knowing internet use are the Elder Futhark runes. The Elder Futhark is a runic alphabet that is actually older than Old Norse. The Old Norse language is written in the runic alphabet called Younger Futhark, and so I've written out the title of this poem in Younger Futhark here. Note, however, that the manuscript that this poem is written in, the Codex Regius, or an Icelandic Konungsbók, is not written in runes. Most of the literature that we have in Old Norse is actually written in a modified form of the Roman alphabet, the same alphabet that we use today. If you want to find the Old Norse text of this poem, many people become intrigued by the poem. The manuscript itself, GKS 2365 Quarto or Codex Regius, can be found in very high quality scans online. So if you have learned a good bit of Old Norse and also studied reading Carolingian insular manuscripts in the early Middle Ages, you could avail yourself of the very original itself. These can be found at the website of the Árni Magnússon Institute at the University of Iceland, at least as I'm speaking in July 2017. There's also Heimskringla.no, which is a website that has Old Norse texts as well as modern Scandinavian translations of them. They have a translation of Hávamál. Note that the text there is taken from a public domain early 20th century edition, and the editor makes some decisions that I wouldn't make in archaizing the Old Norse text, making it look earlier than it is. There's also David Evans' translation of, or not translation, excuse me, his edition of the Old Norse text, Hávamál, with commentary that can be found on the website of the Viking Society for Northern Research. That's a very good resource. And that webpage also has many other good resources, including a new introduction to Old Norse, which is the best available way, I think, to go about learning Old Norse. And then there is also the text edited by Neckel and Kuhn, which you can find online at the Titus Project. Some of this may change if this video stays online for longer than the last one did. You know, links come and go, but in July 2017, those are all valid links. All right, now Hávamál is probably not originally composed as one single continuous poem, but most scholars instead believe that it is a combination of at least 5 smaller constituent poems. Let's look at what these are, because I'll talk about them sometimes as units. First of all, there's Gestaþáttur. This literally means the section Þáttur of guests, Gesta. In this section, which is probably the most famous part of Hávamál, Odin is presenting basically practical wisdom for your daily life. Often this concerns a narrative that's framed around a guest, someone who is traveling around the countryside and has to stay with different people. Hospitality was a central tenet of Norse society, so it's not surprising that there's an emphasis on hospitality here, but also on other themes like moderation and not drinking too much, not talking too much, but also not drinking, not talking. There's an emphasis on watchfulness. There's an emphasis on sort of using your head, but also not being just stuck in your head. It's a really fascinating and also practically useful text, and I'll be talking more about some of those themes later in this video. It's a little hard to say exactly when Gestaþáttur shades into the next section, because they seem to be stitched a little staggered in the transition, but Gestaþáttur is usually considered to end somewhere around stanza 77 to 81. We could split the difference, say, about stanza 79. So it is followed by the section we usually call in Old Norse Demi Odins. So this is Odin's possessive, his demi, his demonstrations. Sometimes in English this is called Odin's love advice. This takes up stanzas, we usually say 80 to 110, and it's concerned not just with a couple stories about Odin's pursuits in the world of love. He tries unsuccessfully to sleep with one woman and successfully to sleep with another, but also sort of general advice about matters of love and relations between the sexes, often from a strikingly cynical viewpoint that we also see in Gestaþáttur. And Demi Odins is followed by the section called Lodfofnismál. So again, mol, the speech or words, and then Lodfofnir, so this is speech or words of or for Lodfofnir. Lodfofnir is a figure who is addressed throughout this section, but it's not clear exactly who this is. He's only mentioned in the poem Hávamál, here and also in the section called Ljóðatól. His name is difficult to interpret. It could be something like shaggy or hairy, same root as you find in, for instance, the name or nickname Ragnar Lothbrok. And then Fofnir, this could be like the name of the dragon, it's the embracer, so it's just like the shaggy embracer. That doesn't make a lot of sense. There could be some kind of kenning going on here. But anyway, who exactly this is unclear. But in this section, Odin is speaking to someone named Lodfofnir and giving him advice. This advice tends not to be quite as practical and hard-nosed as the advice in Gestaþáttur. Some of the same themes are there, but Lodfofnismál also has some magical related advice. And that is usually considered to be 111 to 137. And then stanzas 137 to 145, we have runatal. This is literally the tally or count of runes. In this, or the account of runes, you could also say. In this section, Odin tells us the very mysterious story of how he sacrificed himself to himself on the world tree Yggdrasil. And then he talks about acquiring the wisdom of the runes, which he did by performing this sacrifice, and gives some cryptic hints about runic wisdom. And finally, in stanzas 146 to 164, which we call Ljóðatal, Odin lists 18 magic spells that he knows and tells us what they can do. He does not tell us, however, how to cast them. Hávamál is only found in one manuscript, as I mentioned before. That's the Codex Regius, GKS 2365 Quarto, or an Icelandic Koningsbók. So we are very lucky to have that manuscript, so otherwise we would never know that this poem had existed. Hávamál might have been composed anywhere in the few centuries before the Codex Regius manuscript was written down. The manuscript was written down in about the year 1270. It is a copy of an earlier manuscript from about 1200, although Hávamál shows spelling differences from the other poems in the Codex Regius that suggest it might have been copied from a different manuscript than the other ones were copied from. That in itself is an interesting little detail. There are certain words, especially for princes and geographical features and trees, that suggest that this may have been composed originally in Norway. At least Gestaþóttir seems to have been composed originally in Norway. This doesn't make a huge difference because the medieval language of Norway and Iceland was almost identical, but it's an interesting hint nonetheless. The exact date of composition, very hard to place, and of course the different pieces of Hávamál might have been composed at different times and in different places. But a reasonable date might be the late 900s, at the end of the Viking Age. It's a little hard to believe that certain parts of it could have been composed after Christianity had come to Iceland in the year 1000. But there is an argument that has been made that certain parts of it might have been composed post-Christianity, including perhaps parts of Demi Odin's love advice. The myths of the Norse gods did continue to be told in Christian Iceland, so that's not impossible. But again, the majority of the poem, most likely a survival from before Christianity. The meter of the poem is largely the meter called Ljóðaháttr. I have discussed Old Norse poetic meters in another video. There is also a little bit of Molaháttr, a meter that I haven't discussed. There's an isolated instance of Fornirðislag, and then the section at the end, Ljóðatal, is in Galdralag. This is the meter for talking about or talking in magic spells. Now in this video, I'll be reading from Hávamál in Old Norse and in English. I won't read the entire thing, although I do have a video where I have read Hávamál in Old Norse. I will be reading selections that I think are particularly important for understanding the poem. The Old Norse text that I'm using reflects my reading of the manuscript together with input from editions such as David Evans' edition that I mentioned earlier, as well as Gísla Sigurðsson's Icelandic edition, which I often find very useful. The English text that I'll be reading from is my translation of Hávamál, which is available in my translation of the Poetic Edda, which came out in 2015. I'll be reading from my, quote, normal translation of Hávamál, and not from the Cowboy Hávamál, which is my translation of Gestaþóttir into the voice of my grandfather. The Cowboy Hávamál appears as an appendix in my book, and I do have a video about it on this channel, but I'll be using the normal translation that's a little more literal in this video, even if I think that the tone of the Cowboy Hávamál is often a very good match for the tone of Gestaþóttir. Alright, well, let's proceed by looking at the themes in Gestaþóttir. One of the main themes that we find in Gestaþóttir, this poem of practical wisdom inside Hávamál, is watchfulness. In fact, the very first stanza of Hávamál reads, Gottir allar oðar gangi fram, skoða skili, skygna skili, því að óvíst að vita hvar óvinir sitja og fletti fyrir. At every doorway before you enter, you should look around. You should take a good look around, for you never know where your enemies might be seated within. And you also have to be watchful about the things that other people say about you or to you. In stanza 9, Odin says, Sår sæl sjálfur ó, lof og vit meðan lifir. Því at illråd hefur maður oft þegið, annars brjóstum úr. A man is happy if he finds good advice within himself. Many men have received bad advice by trusting someone else. We must distrust other people to the extent that we remain armed. In stanza 38, Odin says, Vopnum sínum skala maður veli ó feti ganga framar. Því að óvíst at vita nær verður og vegum úti, gers þorf guma. Never go even a single step without a weapon at your side. You never know when you might find yourself in need of a spear. And we must distrust even fate. In stanza 40, Odin says, Fjórsins fengið hefir, skilit maður þorf þóla. Oft spari leiðum, það hefir ljúfum hugat, margt gengur ver en varir. Do not be so sparing in using your money that you don't use it for your own needs. Often what you save for your children will end up in the hands of your enemies. Many things will go worse than you expect. And, of course, we must distrust money. In stanza 78, Odin says, Fullar grindar so ek fyr fitjung sonum, nu bera þeir vanarvol. Svo áður sem augebragð, hann valtastar vinna. I saw big herds of cattle owned by a rich man's sons. Now they carry a beggar's staff. Wealth is like the twinkling of an eye. No friend could be more faithless. And then, of course, there's the famous stanza 77, which has been quoted in numerous songs and all over the internet and here, there, and yonder. Døyr fe, døyr frender, døyr sjálfur et sama. Ek veit ein at aldrei døyr, dómur dauðan hvern. Cows die, family die, you will die the same way. I know only one thing that never dies, the reputation of the one who's died. Note that you'll sometimes see this poem printed with the translation of sheep die rather than what I said, which is cows die. The noun fe in Old Norse means money, property. It often specifically means livestock, and in Old Norse at least, and certainly in Old Norwegian, which again remembers probably the ultimate origin of this poem, the cattle that's typically meant is what I would call beeves where I'm from, cows, steers, bulls. But in Iceland today, that word typically means sheep. So the older meaning of the stanza probably is more to imply cows dying. But at any rate, the idea is that livestock, of course, dies just like you die. It's a very frank observation, of course. Another thing to note is that in the Old Norse text of that stanza, as I read it, you may note the word dauðan hvern. You will sometimes see the Old Norse text of this stanza and others with a word of, where I have a word um. That of represents an attempt to archaize the Old Norse. So that is usually considered an older filler word in Norse poetry than is. Hávamál actually has some instances where there is of, and you'll see stanzas where I do have that word. But people who want to make the text look older sometimes replace the ums with ovs. I prefer to leave it more like how it actually is in the manuscript, just standardizing the spelling a little bit. All right, so note too that Hávamál sticks to this life, right? This is about how nothing will survive you except your reputation. There's no mention of afterlife. There's no mention of really spiritual matters at all in this part of the poem. It's really just advice for this life and this world. Forgive me for the weird lighting situation. The only light I can get into this room is the sun, and the sun has a way of moving around and reflecting off glass outside. All right, so another big theme that we see in Hávamál is a major theme of Old Norse moral behavior, and that's hospitality, the obligations both of guest and of host. So in stanza 2, we read, Gevendur heilir, gestur inkomin, Hvar skal sitja sjå? Mjölk bröder, så och brondum skall, syns fresta frama. Hail to a good host. A guest has come inside. Where should he sit? He is impatient, standing on the threshold, ready to try his luck. You should be generous with your guest, but you don't have to give him more than you can afford. In stanza 52, Odin says, Mycket ett skall amani geva, oft köper ser I litlu lov. Med hovum hlev och med hållu kerry, fäck ek mer felaga. You should not give only big gifts. Often a little thing will win you favor. I have won friends with just half a loaf of bread and a bowl of soup. There is, however, whatever your obligations, also an imperative to travel. So you should be a good traveler, a good guest, and a good host, and you should definitely get out there and do this, get around, travel. In stanza 18, Odin says, Så en vet vida ratar, och hever fjöld farit. Hver you gedi styr gumna hver, så vitandi vits. Only a man who is wide-traveled and has wandered far can know something about how other men think. Such a man is wise. And wherever you go, you should talk and listen to other people and not just keep to yourself. In stanza 57, Odin says, Brander av brandi, brenn uts brunnen funni kveikis av funna. Maður av manni verður at molikuder, en til dulskur av dul. A torch is lit by another and burns till it's burned out. A fire is kindled by another fire. A man becomes wise by speaking with other men, but foolish by keeping to himself. And while you should travel around and visit people, you shouldn't stay forever and let your welcome wear out. In stanza 35, Odin says, Ganga skalla gestur vera, I einum stað. Ljúfur verður leiður, ef lengi situr, annars fletjum ó. You should keep moving. You should never be a guest forever in any one place. Your welcome will wear out if you stay too long beneath another's roof. And as you can see, Odin values learning. He talks about learning from other people, talking to other people, but also not being too showy about it. There's a certain just practical value to being intelligent. It's not about showing off and being pedantic, as we see in the next few stanzas. Stanza 6, At hygiandi sinni skilit maður hrussen vera, heldur gatin at gedi. Þó horskur og þógun, kemur heimisgarða til, sjáldan verður viti vorum. Því at óbreygra vinn vera maður aldregi, en mannvit mikið. A wise man is not showy about his wisdom. He guards it carefully. He is silent when he comes to a stranger's home. The wise man seldom wanders into harm, for you can never have a more faithful friend than a good supply of wisdom. And more along these lines of not being too showy and not being too arrogant about it. Stanza 22, Vesalmaður og ilaskapi, klær at hvívetna. Hitki han veit han vita þyrfti, at han vama vanar. A stupid man and an undisciplined one laughs at everything. He hasn't learned a lesson that would do him good. He himself isn't flawless. This is a good thing to reflect on before making YouTube comments. And Odin is not unaware of the price that wisdom often brings with it. In stanza 55 we read, Meðalsnotur skilji manna hver, eva tilsnotur se, því at snoturs manns hjarta verður sjaldan glatt, ef svo allsnotur ó. You should be only a little wise, never too wise. A wise man's heart is seldom glad if he's truly wise. There are also several other stanzas along similar lines. And Odin frequently makes mention of the fact that one of the greatest enemies of wisdom is drinking too much. In stanza 12 he says, Svo gott sem gott kveða alda svona, Kviet færre vet flere drekker syns til gets gummi. There is not as much good as men claim there is in alcohol for one's well-being. A man knows less as he drinks more and loses more and more of his wisdom. Odin even tells a personal story here in stanza 14 where he relates Ólr ek varð over Ulvi, at ins froða fjallars. Því Ólr batst, at after of heimtir, hörsit geð gummi. I was drunk. I was too drunk at Fjallar's house. The best kind of feast is the one you go home from with all your wits about you. A Fjallar is a name that we know from the story of the Odrerir, the Norse mead of poetry. Although in that story there's no account of Odin getting drunk at the house of Fjallar, who is a dwarf in that story. But this could be a lost tale somewhere. And Odin emphasizes not only to be moderate in drinking, but to be moderate in other aspects of life as well in a similar way. In stanza 19 we read, Haldit maður og keri, drekki þó at hófi mjóð, meli þarft eða þegi. Kynnist þess for þig engi maður, að þú gangir snemma at sofa. Don't hold on to the mead horn, but drink your fair share. Say something useful or stay quiet, and no one else will judge you poorly if you go to sleep early. Another matter of life to be moderate and cautious about is eating. In stanza 21 we read, Hjarðir that vitu, när þær heim skulu, og ganga þó of grassi. En ósvíðar maður kann evagi, síns mól maga. Even cows know when they should go home and leave behind the fields, but an unwise man does not know the measure of his own appetite. And once again, we read about being cautious about speaking in stanza 29. Urdna melir, so eva þegir, staðlásu stafi. Praðmel tunga nema haldendur eigi, sér ógót gelar. You will hurt yourself with all your talking if you never close your mouth. A hasty tongue, unless it's disciplined, often earns its owner punishment. And then a very similar thought is in the fragmentary stanza that survives the stanza 65. Orða þeirra maður óðrum segir, oft hann gjöld getur. You will often get repayment in kind for the words you speak to others. And there's diverse advice about other things. For instance, there's advice about sleep habits and worry, such as in stanza 23. Ósvíðar maður vakir allar nætur og hyggur at hvívetna. Þó móður at morgni kemur, allt vil sem var. A fool stays awake all night worrying about everything. He's fatigued when the morning comes, and his problems remain unsolved. Another stanza of advice concerns sleeping is stanza 58, which reminds us of the Viking society in which these stanzas originated. Or skal rísa, so annars vil, fe eða fjör hafa. Sjaldan liggjandi úlfur, lær getur, ne sofandi maður sigur. Rise early if you want to take another man's property or his life. A sleeping wolf seldom wins a sheep, or a sleeping warrior a victory. But lastly, one of the major values that is discussed in Hávamál again and again is the value of friendship. For instance, in stanza 34, which is somewhat famous, we read, Afhvarf mikill til ills vinnar, þótt og bratu búi, en til góðs vinnar liggja gagnvegir, þótt hann sé fyrr farin. It's a long and crooked walk to a bad friend, even if he lives nearby, but it's an easy road to a good friend, no matter how long the journey. Stanza 43 acknowledges a world of friends and enemies, of course. Vinn sínum skal maður vinnur vera, þeim og þess vinn, en óvinnar síns skili engi maður vinnur vera. Be a friend to your friend and also to his friend, but never be a friend to the enemy of your friend. Of course, in a world so hostile, it's important to have reciprocal relations with friends and make sure that both are getting something out of it. In stanza 44, we read, Veits þú, ef þú vinn åt, þann þú vel trúir, og vill þú af honum gott geta. Geði skal þú við hann blanda og gjöfum skipta, fara að finna oft. If you have a good friend and really trust him and want good to come of your friendship, you should speak your mind with him, exchange gifts, visit him often. And another famous stanza, 47, where Odin reminds us of the sheer joy of good friendship. Ungur var ek forðum, for ek ein saman, þó varð ek vilur vega. Auðugur þóttum ek annan fan, maður manns gaman. I was young once, I walked alone, and I became lost on my way. I felt like I was rich when I met another traveler. People's joy is in other people. So these are some of the major themes of the advice that we find in Gestaþóttir. Of course, there are many other pearls of wisdom in this poem. As you'll see, the advice is for the most part not restricted to a Viking-like society. There is the stanza about getting up early if you want to kill someone, but for the most part this advice is very ecumenical. I mean, it's really pretty worldwide applicable and not too different from the kind of advice that we find in other ancient and medieval poems of proverbial wisdom, including, of course, the Book of Proverbs, also the Egyptian instructions of Ptah-hotep, or the instructions of Shuruppak from ancient Mesopotamia. Or you can find similarities today in, just as I've said, the advice that one might give to a grandchild, or in, as one student pointed out to me, in Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac, or perhaps even in a work like those of Confucius. So the advice is pretty worldwide, pretty applicable to any kind of situation, and doesn't require the sort of Norse cultural setting for the most part. But now I'll move on to the next section of the poem, Dimi Oðins. In the section called Dimi Oðins, as I've pointed out, the main theme is relations between the sexes, and also just more generally avenues of human life where distrust is warranted. In fact, stanzas 85 to 89 are just a long list of things that you should not trust, and this list ends with the words in the end of stanza 89, Verðit maður svo tryggur að þessu trúi olu. May a man not be so trusting that he trusts all of these things. And of course, you especially should not trust the other sex. In stanza 84, Odin says, Moir orðum skili mangi trúa, ne því kveður kona. Því at og hverfanda hveli voru þeim hjörtu skopuð, brygð í brjóst lagið. No man should trust the words of a girl, nor anything a woman says. Women's hearts are molded on a wobbly wheel. Deception lurks in their words. But Odin, of course, is a realist who knows both men and women, so it's not just women who are called untrustworthy in this poem. In stanza 91, for instance, Odin says, Bert ek numali, því at ek bæði veit, brygðar karla hugur konum. Þó ver fegur smalum, ver flost hyggjum, that teller horska hyggi. I'll speak plainly now, since I know both men and women. Men lie to women. We speak most eloquently when we tell the biggest lies, and seduce even wise women with lies. But there's also a very tolerant attitude in this poem toward the weakness and stupidity that love can bring out in any one of us. For instance, in stanza 94, we read, Øyvitar firna maður annan skal, þess margan gengur guma. Heimska or horskum, gerir hóða sonu, so en motgi munar. No man should mock another for falling in love. Love is strong enough to make a fool out of a man who once was wise, and haven't we all experienced that? The Dimi Oðins also contains two stories briefly told by Odin about times when he tried or succeeded in seducing a different woman. The first one concerns his attempt to seduce a woman he calls Billings Moy. Now, Billinger, that name appears as a name of both giants and dwarves in Norse mythology. It's not clear exactly who this is supposed to be, but typically the giants are considered more desirable sexual partners by the gods than dwarves are. So it's fairly likely this is the daughter. That's how we typically read Moi, which means girl of someone named Billinger, who's probably a giant. Odin fails to seduce her, but then we read about his seduction of the giant lady named Gunnlod, which is part of the story of how Odin got the magical meat of poetry called Odreir. Part of the story of his seduction of Gunnlod involves his leaving her behind and then being pursued by her father to Osgardr, where the gods live. And this leads to a somewhat famous quote. This is the first half of stanza 110. Bergeið Odin, hig ek at unnit havi, what skal hans trygg them trua? I believe that Odin swore an oath to them, but who can trust Odin? Note that it's Odin saying that. Of course, this is very much in his character as we know him from the sagas and other poems of the Edda. Now, after telling these stories about his amorous adventures, we turn to Lodfulfnismal, where Odin is giving advice, again, to someone we don't know anything about, named Lodfulfnir. For the most part, the stanzas of this section all begin with the same refrain. They all begin, Róðum hver Lodfulfnir, en þú róð nemir, njóta mundu ef þú nemir, þér munu góð ef þú getur. I translate that, I counsel you, Lodfulfnir, if you'll take my advice, you'll profit if you learn it, it'll do you good if you remember it. Not every single stanza in this section begins that way. Sometimes two stanzas seem to be one thought, and then only the first one will begin with this refrain, but it's repeated numerous times throughout this section. The advice that's given here often has a similarity to the advice that we find in Gestathulter, although sometimes with a more magical turn to it. Two themes that we see return to, just like in Gestathulter, are watchfulness. For instance, in stanza 131, after the refrain, Odin says, Varan bið ek þig vera ok eigi of varan. Verð þú við ól varastur ok við annars konu ok við það þriðja að þjófar ne leiki. Which is, I advise you to be wary, though never fearful. Be most wary about drinking, about other men's women, and about a third thing, about men and their temptation to steal. And then there's also, in stanza 133, a continued theme from Demi Odin's about sort of tolerance, perhaps, for others' flaws. Stanza 133, Oft vitu ogorla þeir sitja inni fyrir, hvers þeir kins koma. At maður svo góður at galli ne fylgi, ne svo illur at enugi dugi. Those inside the house rarely know anything about the stranger who knocks at their door, but there is no man so good that he has no flaw, nor a man so bad he's good for nothing. Now, having shared advice in Gestathulter, advice about love in Demi Odin's, and advice about miscellaneous topics in Lodfulfnismal, we now turn to the most mysterious part of Hávamál and perhaps the entire poetic Edda, which is the beginning of Runatal, stanza 138, when Odin talks about his sacrifice of himself to himself. Veit ek at ek hek vinga meði ó, natur allar níu. Geri undaður og gefin Odni, sjálfum mer, og þeim meði mangi veit, hvers hann af rótum renn. I know that I hung on a wind-battered tree 9 long nights, pierced by a spear and given to Odin, myself to myself, on that tree whose roots grow in a place no one has ever seen. This sacrifice of himself to himself, hanging from Yggdrasil, the world tree, and also pierced by a spear, is very similar to an account that we read in Gautreks saga, where Odin requests that a king be sacrificed to him. That king is also hanged and stabbed with a spear. I have translated that section of Gautreks saga into English, and I'm going to put that onto my Patreon page as a Patreon reward if people want to go check that out and compare it. It's an interesting scene that has also been made somewhat better known by being referenced in Neil Gaiman's American Gods. Rune Natal then goes on to talk about the use of runes in magic. Odin mentions sort of his own experiences in learning them, and also some cryptic clues about their use, before moving on to Ljóðatal, which is where Odin talks about the 18 magic spells that he knows. Again, he doesn't actually tell us how to do these. That would be too cool, right? But instead just narrates in Galdhurlag the meter that's associated, again, with magic spells, the magic spells that he knows how to do. So let me give you an example of one of these. Stanza 156. That kan ek it elpta, evek skal til orustu leita langvinni. Under randir gel en þer með ríki fara, heilir hildar til, heilir hildi frá, koma þér heilir hvaðan. Which in English is, I know an 11th spell. If I lead old friends into a battle, I enchant their shields so that they will have the victory. They will go to battle unharmed and return from battle unharmed. They will come home without harm. And finally, after narrating these 18 magic spells that he knows how to cast, Odin wishes us farewell in the last stanza of Hávamál, stanza 164. Nú eru Hávamál kveðin, Hóva hollu í, alþorf ýta sonum, óþorf jotna sonum, heilsór hvað, heilsór kann, njóti sór nam, heilir þér hlýtu. In English, now the words of the one-eyed or the High One are heard in Valhalla, for the benefit of humans, for the harm of giants. Health to you who speak them, health to you who know them, joy to you who learned them, health to you who hear them. And I certainly also wish you health and joy, and I thank you for taking the time to listen to my discussion of Hávamál. This is based, of course, on something like an introduction to the poem that I give in my Norse mythology classes, although obviously we go into much more detail there. I hope that if you're interested in taking a look at the poem in Old Norse, you'll take a look at some of the links that I mentioned earlier, or perhaps look for something like Gísli Sigurdsson's book. This is called Edukvæði, with Icelandic language commentary, or David Evans' text and commentary of Hávamál that I mentioned on the Viking Society website. I hope also that if you haven't yet, you'll take a look at my translation of the Poetic Edda, which includes the Hávamál translation I've been reading from, as well as the Cowboy Hávamál, my special translation of Gestaþóttir in honor of my grandfather, which I'll also link a reading to in the end screen of this video. For now, from the University of California, Berkeley, I'm wishing you all the best.